study. Thank you for coming today and to IAS Thursday. And I want to open this event by remembering that the land we are on is the ancestral homeland of the Dakota people, and the IAS recognizes that we are relative newcomers to this land, and we honor and respect this place in recognition of all the Dakota and Ojibwe nations of Minnesota. So we have a big event coming on April 18th. I wanted to make people aware of Carol Anderson, the sociologist who is the author of White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, is going to be here. And for two events, well, she'll be here for one event. We'll be here for two events on April 18th. So IAS Thursday will be a little different that day. It will be a sort of book group discussion led by history professor and IAS fellow Melinda Lindquist. And then at 7 p.m. on the big auditorium stage downstairs, Carol Anderson will be speaking. Tickets are available at the box office windows or online from Northrop, and there's a discount for students and faculty and staff. Next Thursday we'll be upstairs in the Best Buy Theater. Our event is going to be a play performance by Rickerby Hines from the University of California, Riverside, and this is part of our 1968-69 series. So next week, upstairs in Best Buy Theater. So it's my very great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker today and to thank the law school for sponsoring today's event. If you noticed a table on the outside, I just want to point out that the bookstore has kindly brought over books, and our speaker and author has agreed to sign them. So I'm happy to introduce Professor Fionnuala Aoláin, who is a University Regents Professor. She's the holder of the Robina Chair in Law, Public Policy, and Society, and the Faculty Director of the Human Rights Center at the University of Minnesota Law School. She's concurrently Professor of Law at Queen's University of Belfast School of Law, and probably the thing that we are most proud of to have her in our midst for is that she's also the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Thus the topic of her talk today. She received her undergraduate degree and PhD in law at the Queen's University Law Faculty in Belfast and her Master's of Law degree from Columbia Law School. She's the recipient of numerous academic awards and honors and publications, way too many to list, but they cover the fields of emergency powers, conflict regulation, transitional justice, and sex-based violence in times of war. That's just a small portion. She's worked on issues around human rights and international law at the highest level, including her appointment by the UN Secretary General as special expert on promoting gender equality in times of conflict and peacemaking in 2003. She was also nominated twice by the Irish government to the European Court of Human Rights, the first woman and the first academic lawyer to be thus nominated. And she's an elected member of the Executive Committee for the Belfast-based Committee on the Administration of Justice, a member of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, and I'm assuming this is more local, a member of the board of the Center for Victims of Torture's National Advisory Council. So without further ado.
Thank you. It's really lovely to see such a big crowd on a grayish afternoon. So it's my distinct pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm going to talk about human rights in an age of terrorism. I'm going to talk partly out of the scope of my academic interests, but also a little bit informed by my work as United Nations Special Rapporteur. Let me just start briefly and say a little bit about that work, so it's sort of you get a sense of what the scope and content of the work is and how it frames some of the challenges and the substance I want to talk about today. I was appointed as Special Rapporteur in August 2017. So I'm the first woman to hold that role, and generally these positions tend to be held by military people who have had that kind of background, not by academics, but it's a fairly masculine space. So being the first woman Special Rapporteur is both disarming for those who meet me and often results in them underestimating both your knowledge and your capacity simultaneously. You're appointed by states, so I was appointed with the support of a number of governments, the Irish and British governments in particular. But it's a voting process. You go through the same kind of process one might go through for a public appointment, senior public appointment in government. And you have a 3-year term that's extendable to 6. I have 3 what might be called powers or capacities in my role as Special Rapporteur. The first is that I conduct country visits, so at the request or invitation of a state, I will go and visit and assess that state's country's compliance with its counterterrorism, through counterterrorism practice to its international law obligations. So it's looking at whether the state, in the way in which it engages in counterterrorism, and 2 other things, 2 new terms that might be new to the audience: countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism with international law. And that involves, once I'm allowed or invited in, full access to prisons, the military, the intelligence, police, so the entire, if you want, apparatus of security within the state. But I also will meet with civil society, with academics, with victims of terrorism, and I visit prisons, so I see a lot of jihadis in my work these days. And the second thing I do is I issue 2 formal thematic reports each year, one to the General Assembly of the United Nations, one to the Human Rights Council. And there I identify issues, particularly compelling issues in the interface between human rights and counterterrorism that I think states need to be aware of. Sometimes I do what's called soft law work, where I'm trying to develop norms or practices within the work of states, encouraging state practice or guiding state practice in particular ways. And then I go and I have a public, if you want, hearing. I have an annual 3-hour slot before the General Assembly, usually during the autumn session of the General Assembly, and I'm just back from the Human Rights Council in Geneva, where my report in the spring focused on the misuse of counterterrorism against civil society activists and the effects of counterterrorism in the civic space. And the third capacity I have is I hear individuals, so I have an office, it's not me, staff in Geneva, and we receive individual communications, hundreds of them, from individuals or groups who've been targeted by counterterrorism, state security, countering or preventing violent extremist policy or practice by the state. So if you're on Twitter, you might today, or the issue that I was dealing with was a communication from Australia. The Australian government, in response to the events in New Zealand last week, put through a piece of legislation yesterday on stripping content off the internet. Now, obviously, there are good reasons to be concerned about violent and extremist content on the internet, but when you have a 2-day turnaround for the passage of legislation, which with no notice about that legislation and a party line vote, those of us who are concerned about things like freedom of expression and definitions of terrorism that might be included in such legislation, have deep concerns that it will reach too far and affect legitimately protected speech, even if that speech is uncomfortable. So today's Twitter blast from the Special Rapporteur was on Australian legislation, but it could be any number of things. So those are my 3 capacities, and in addition, my office is what's called an entity. The UN Global Counterterrorism Architecture is made up of 38 entities. So the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is one, Interpol is one, the High Commissioner for Refugees is another, so different bodies, and I am one of those entities, which means that I sit in the kind of fulcrum of decision making, at least at the lower level, because obviously most of the decision making work is done by the Security Council, but the entities have a role in regulation. So happy to talk about any of that in the Q&A. But let me start substantively by saying that, as many of you in the room will know, countering terrorism has been at the forefront of foreign policy priorities for states. And that's particularly true and triggered by the events of 9/11. It's true for democracies and for non-democracies. And what's interesting is that for democracies in particular, which is where a number of my remarks are focused upon today, This necessity to regulate terrorism has coincided with the growth of human rights narratives as a fundamental aspect of their foreign policy priorities. But it's also clear that in the same period, a number of counter-terrorism measures, such as those involving the use of torture, inhuman and degrading treatment at the detention facilities at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, that I had the pleasure, that's the right word, of visiting, the confirmation of black sites that have been used for interrogation of individuals, extended state surveillance powers, which are growing both in terms of scope and the technology that's being deployed to do surveillance across multiple societies, and things like the now regular use of biometric data raise serious rights concerns. So you have this sort of need to respond to terrorism, but also this sort of almost contradictory impulse to and practice of including human rights rhetoric. And so in that context, there's a really fundamental question of how states ensure security while protecting the fundamental human rights that they claim are the bedrock of their society and their external policies. I want to note that as I've said in my academic work over many decades, the challenges of promoting and protecting human rights while countering terrorism are not new. I've spent much of my adult life in Belfast. I grew up there. Terrorism is not, despite the views of some scholars and policymakers, a post-9/11 phenomenon. It's a deeply old and rooted phenomenon. Those of you, the historians in the room, will recall the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on a bridge in Sarajevo, which was the event that triggered the First World War. Second World War. First, yes, yeah. See, not enough coffee today. And that act, Serbian nationalist, and act terrorism, triggering this broader set of regional and global phenomena. And it's been true for both scholars and practitioners that various metaphors are used to describe the relationship between security and rights. And often, I think many of you will have heard the metaphor of balancing. We have to balance security with rights in legal and political debates. And so my approach, which is reflected in this lecture, while recognizes the kind of ubiquity of the use of balancing as a means to address the security rights interface, I think there are a number of flaws with the balancing methodology. Let me start by saying that balancing requires trade-offs. It places security and rights in tension with one another or in competition, and that in the process of trading one off against the other, we often end up with a lack of integration between the two. They're situated as sort of polar extremities. My view, both as Special Rapporteur but also in my scholarly work, has been to view security and rights as interdependent. So while security may in some sense be regarded as a prerequisite for the enjoyment of liberties, in another sense the protection of liberty is a prerequisite for the enjoyment of security. The two are intertwined against each other. They're not at odds with one another. And I see that every day in my work. Security without human rights is an illusion. It's a colossus with very clay feet. It's a bare bones of security that often doesn't correspond to the most basic entitlements of each human person. But rights without security is also an illusion. Having all the rights you want, theoretically, if you're not feeling safe in your home, in your community, in your streets, is also problematic. So I'm going to proceed by doing a couple of things. I want to address what I've described as a series of 4 myths about the security rights interface. And the approach, at least rhetorically, or maybe to just poke some fun, is to challenge some sacred cows or accepted mantras in the literature about the practice of responding to the terrorism and rights interface. But I am concerned, these mantras are not just, it's not just a kind of a rhetorical device. I'm concerned about the way in which these common mantras actually pervade security space and how they are utilized deliberately to place human rights and security in tension in ways that are not helpful. My role as Special Rapporteur I view as, in part, displacing some of these myths and offering an alternative starting point. So let's start with that first one that I've canvassed already, which is the idea that security and rights are at odds. And I've become particularly concerned about the rhetoric, the legal structure, and the institutional architecture of global counter-terrorism governance that assumes that security and human rights are two separate and discrete entities and that they're at odds with one another. I want to say, building on my opening remarks, that security, that is the right to be secure in one's physical, economic, social, and psychological self, is built into the DNA of human rights values and norms. Security is in fact a human right. It's guaranteed in its most fundamental articulation in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which guarantees the right to life, liberty, and security of person without distinction under Article 3 of the Declaration. This principle was translated 20 years later into Articles 6 and 9 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is a binding treaty to which 171 states, including the United States, are state parties. So what I want to say is the underpinning values of the international human rights instruments and system don't make sense unless you understand that security is exactly sort of intersection into the structure and the values of that international system. But it's also, as I've said in my opening, clear, both in the scholarly literature and in many policy debates, that security and rights are often traded off, perceived as being traded off against each other. And this trade-off thesis, both intellectually and practically, places these two things in separate spheres and engages them in a battle from which often very tangible things follow. Critics of the trade-off philosophy, including myself, have noted that the result of this is to obscure the complex and codependent relationship between these two values. Trade-off thinking, in my view, tends to prioritize security, and usually security-first approaches through an insidious creep of security ordering preference. The reasons for this are obvious. When one conducts, balancing exercises are not conducted in the abstract. Like, we're not doing a balancing exercise here today. Balancing exercise is usually conducted in a time of great upheaval and under extreme circumstances when fear, hatred, and similar emotions prevail. And rational discourses and analysis are likely to be pushed aside in the formulation of policy. And so it's not, balancing just isn't happening in a sort of in a sealed container. It's happening in real time, and that real time affects what happens to it in the process. My view is that balancing functions to disregard or minimize the importance of human rights, leading to an erosion in the short, medium, and long term of human rights protection. I want to say that I think it's important to recall when we think about balancing, that balancing security measures tend to have both retail and wholesale dimensions. Wholesale security includes things that everyone in this room, I'm sure, is familiar with, something like airport screening, in which, in theory, the general population is subject to the same measures in the same way. And these measures are often justified because they are kind of equally, they're sort of equal opportunity intrusions. Everyone is theoretically subject to the same kinds of intrusions. They're, quote, minimally invasive, and the ends justify the means. But we tend to lose, when we look at wholesale security measures, the impact of such measures relative, the proportionality of such measures, and in particular their impact on particular communities. So we tend to minimize the effect of these wholesale measures in general, but we also tend to disregard the disparate effect on individuals and communities, and in particular the racial and other profiling elements of such measures. They're sold because they look the same for everyone, but in fact that doesn't tend to be the case in practice. And what's also clear is that there's a much higher tolerance for security measures that appear, in theory, to be general in nature, not specific. But we don't measure the costs, is what I want to say, of those wholesale measures in real ways on those who are most likely to be disparately affected. By contrast, retail security measures tend to be justified in highly specific ways, meaning that they will precisely impact specified groups or high-risk individuals. I think in particular about the language of foreign fighters at the moment. If you go online, it's like a hot button category for things that are justified to do to certain groups. So if you fall in the foreign fighter group, or you're a wife or partner or child of a foreign fighter, there are lots of things we think we can do to you that we don't do to others. But I want to say that there are other risks with these retail measures. They include, again, targeting of minority and vulnerable groups perceived of as suspect by the state, whether such group perceptions are empirically justified or not. It might interest us all in the room to know that the fastest rising category of global terrorist threat is not jihadis, but white nationalists and extreme far-right groups. So you think about what measures are used against which groups, we might want to measure which group we think is most affected by a particular practice. What I want to say is, in the context of retail measures, is this us-them distinction is used by used as a device to justify exceptional powers, is both well understood and one of its fundamental fault lines. When security concerns dominate, particularly in the context of terrorism, emotions run high, and the didactic of us versus them serves several functions. It allows people to vent anger in the face of actual or perceived danger. It allows the direct negative emotional energies that follow from extreme violence to be targeted towards particular groups or individuals that are clearly identified as different. This same theme of us or them allows for a greater willingness to confer exceptional security powers on the government when the other is well defined and clearly separable from the quote regular members of society or the community. This pattern is all the more pronounced when the other is perceived as an outsider or a group that has little political leverage or influence. In the face of terrorism in particular, the apparent neutrality of balancing bears little resemblance in practice to the process of calibration that occurs in the aftermath of a terrorist attack or in the heightened responses to the fear of another assault. We only need to think of the targeting of Muslim American communities in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 to underscore the point. So while the rhetoric of balancing admirably affirms the virtue of the middle road and the sort of taking into account of all relevant factors, the ability to remain unmoved by fear, by animus, by overreaction in practice is little understood. And in my view, it means that balancing approaches may be ill-suited to do the work of ensuring the protection of human rights while genuinely engaging in necessary security advancement. So that's the first myth. These two things are at odds in how we address them. The second myth I want to address is one I've alluded to. I'm going to call it the myth of where terrorism happens. My scholarly and policy work over many years simultaneously acknowledges the global threat of terrorism, but in parallel I remain deeply skeptical of the hyperbole that accompanies the policy management of the threat. So let's start with the where of terrorism. If we do that, there's an opportunity to interrogate the specificity and locales of terrorism threats, an analysis that enables a more nuanced and precise approach to the management of that threat, including its legal dimensions. Moreover, as the scale of the threat has been distinctly correlated to the development of a global counterterrorism architecture, a more rigorous understanding of the data and trends, I think, would bring much needed balance and perspective into the assumptions that pervade securitized legal responses at the global level. So anybody want to guess which countries have the highest threat of terrorism? I'm going to do a Q&A. Anybody want to take a guess?
India?
Israel.
Not Israel.
Syria?
Syria is one, yeah. Yeah.
India?
India, no. No. They are, as of last year, so this is last year's list, the countries with the highest levels of terrorism were Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Syria, and Pakistan. These are in terms of deaths, and we use a casualty rate to assess this. So I want to say that these statistics are carried, these are the security sector statistics, so if you take other statistics, these are not NGO statistics. So these are in the assessments I get to see that maybe you don't get to see. But of that, 78% of global terrorism-related deaths happened in those countries. Now, what this suggests to me is it tells us how alarming the situation in these 5 countries in particular are. But what it also tells us is that the scale of risk management, rhetoric, and securitization in countries which have statistically little or no chance of actually experiencing terrorism is really outsize the data we have about where terrorism threat lies. And so one of the challenges is that much of the scholarly and policy analysis that has emerged post 9/11 indicates that the phenomenon of political violence or terrorism manifests in the same way. It assumes that the causes conducive are similar, and that one cookie cutter approach fits all. And it assumes that the scale and level of threat is similar globally. It's just simply not the case. That kind of, the lumpen analysis that sort of puts all of it together it's both intellectually unsatisfying as a terrorism or human rights scholar, but it also increases the likelihood that you're going to get ill-suited and badly thought through management strategies that fail to address the complexity and the nuance of violence at the national level, but also at the specific level. If we take those 5 countries, one might argue that in fact what we need is a Marshall Plan for 5 countries, a really specific set of highly integrated and thoughtful solutions to the problems in the places that are producing 78% of the global violence related to terrorism, and not an approach that thinks everything looks the same. But I also want to say that one of the challenges about this lack of disaggregation at a global policy and at a scholarly level about terrorism has been the way in which global institutions, including the United Nations Security Council, regulate terrorism. So much of the Security Council work, the Security Council is one of the bodies I deal with regularly in my role as Special Rapporteur, is an assumption or an agreed, I want to say, convenient position for states that the level of threat nationally is the same for all. And one might ask in Machiavellian form, why is it that it is convenient for states to work under that prevailing assumption? And one, of course, there are a number of reasons for that. One is because we do not have a globally agreed definition of terrorism. We have failed over 30 years of treaty negotiation to produce a comprehensive treaty on terrorism. What that means is that we use the word terrorism at the Security Council with no agreed definition. We have a working framework that's in a resolution called 1566, but there's no global definition. So every state gets to call who it wants, effectively, a terrorist, and to define terrorism in its own way. And so what we are seeing in practice around the world is an upsurge in the use of counterterrorism measures against civil society activists, human rights defenders, bloggers, intellectuals, moderate religious leaders, women drivers, name that country, and indigenous rights defenders. So criminalization is not just in terms of crime, but we're also seeing an increased criminalization of what we call material support to terrorism. And that increasingly is starting to catch humanitarian actors working in highly complex fraught sites like Syria, Yemen, Nigeria, the countries we've just named as the countries with the highest levels of violence in the world where those needs are most pronounced. And what we are seeing is the targeting of these groups and a global set of practices by states that are profoundly unsettling. And that was really the substance of my report to the Human Rights Council a couple of weeks ago, tracking global trends and empirical data on the misuse of counterterrorism against civil society actors. And what we're seeing, I think, is the nefarious effects of global counterterrorism mandates being internalized by states as a shortcut to quash domestic political challengers, to marginalize critics, to ostracize unpopular political or social views, and to end legitimate political debates. And the problem is we sit in an architecture that simply doesn't call that out, because no state is seeking to undermine any other state's definition of terrorism. The result, of course, is that we are getting a completely non-integrated model of security and rights. And my view is that it's self-defeating both for rights and for security in the long run. Integrating a granular, country-specific and human rights-centered approach to the terrain of political violence, to complex conflict and intercommunal strife, would bring decades of experience that we already have in the global community about how to manage complex problems. But instead, when you put everything into this lumpen box of terrorism, you actually eliminate the capacity to do that work. And in the long run, which we can talk about, I'm going to talk about now, you undermine the very basis for effectively fighting terrorism. That is to say, it's not just bad human rights policy, it's actually bad terrorism policy, because there are genuine and real security threats in the world. We don't fix them by locking up bloggers and intellectuals and judges and lawyers and university professors, because they simply happen to disagree with the government. All right, so that second myth, the where of terrorism, and the who is the terrorist, I think, come together. The third myth is that democracies are ineffective against terrorism. So there's a well-parsed adage, which is provided by the judicial opinion of the very thoughtful former Chief Justice of Israel, Aharon Barak, and he, in a number of cases, used a metaphor or a motif that argued that democracies fight terrorism with their hands tied behind their back. That was his metaphor. And so while that adage, I think, correctly recognizes some specific complexities for democracies addressing violent challenges, both as a scholar and a special rapporteur, I have responded pretty forcefully to that claim, including to Judge Barak himself, that democratic and representative governments are disadvantaged in the long run, that's the important point, in the long run, in the management of terrorism. Rather, I want to make the case that it is only free and open societies with representative governments that have the remotest chance of ever addressing the causes and drivers of terrorism. Understanding the long-term and durable strength of representative governments to address terrorism requires engagements both with the manifestations of terrorism, like what does it look like, but more particularly with the causes of terrorism. I think we spend a lot of time as scholars and policymakers talking about defeating, ending, managing terrorism. We use those kind of action words. But we spend much less time thinking about the individual, communal, institutional, and structural causes that enable and produce terrorism. Meaningful engagement with the structures, conditions, and triggers to indiscriminate violence by groups and by individuals ought to be self-evident. Like, that just seems like a no-brainer, as Americans would say. Not least because it's grounded in the efficient use of generally finite resources. But I think it's particularly important that we address the conditions conducive to terrorism. And we're starting to do that at a global level. Because almost 20 years after 9/11, I mean, it bears thinking about. When the events of 9/11 occurred, Osama bin Laden was holed up in a remote part of Afghanistan because he had been essentially banished from every other part of the earth, and he couldn't go very far. And he had a small band. They weren't globally known. They were chatter. They probably should have been louder chatter for some intelligence services. But look where we are 20 years later. Spread of global jihad, the numbers of sites in which this ideology has rooted itself in. But 20 years of militarized responses to terrorism haven't limited the spread of these violent ideologies, but in my view and the view of many others, may in fact have contributed and enabled them. And that's what we're starting to see in some of the more thoughtful and rigorous data that's emerging on the causes of terrorism. I particularly commend a report that was written last year. It's a 5-year study by UNDP called Journey to Extremism in Africa. It plots the kind of extremism, the manifestations of extremism in Africa. And when you spend a lot of time talking to jihadis, you get to understand a little bit about what's driving and motivating them. All right, and that's not to justify, but it is to say we would be better equipped to come up with policy solutions where we think about the causes conducive, which include the challenges both of rule of law deficits, governance, corruption, poor and limited economic opportunity, and foreign policies of states, including the state we sit in, the United States and other parts of the world. So nothing justifies global violent extremism, but we have to acknowledge that it doesn't arise in a vacuum. Narratives of grievance, whether they are actual or perceived, have to be accounted for. Narratives of injustice, also true. And we have to look at the ways in which good governance, human rights, and rule of law are essential to addressing the conditions that produce the violence. And of course, who better to do that than democracies and open societies? Closed societies have little chance of advancing those conversations. Mostly, they try to close them down. Okay. The final myth I want to address is that I'm going to say the gap. It's called the gap between what you say and what you do, and it matters in my view. So numerous states claim that they're engaged in human rights compliant counterterrorism activities, and increasingly the United Nations does the same, despite a very awkward hesitancy to do it in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. You almost never heard the word human rights in the context of counterterrorism, those phrases being used in the same breath by the Security Council. But we have a series of Security Council resolutions that increasingly at least use the language of human rights. Although, as the prominent feminist scholar Hilary Charlesworth says, it's like the decorative fringe on the edge of the table, meaning it's not sitting squarely in the middle. It's invoked conveniently and not always substantively. But that said, we've come a long way from not mentioning the word. But it's also clear to say that many of the global governance structures are not prioritizing, in particular the Security Council resolution, have failed to centralize human rights in the mainstream approaches to addressing the challenge of terrorism. And that includes not just the idea of human rights, but fundamental and basic rule of law. What we're seeing is, as I said, the sort of decorative fringe, human rights being minimized to these generic lines in a resolution, the occasional question in a country survey when an expert or the Secretary General shows up. Today he's in Libya being besieged by the armed forces of the general who's about to take over the country. But in short, while there's this increased use of the rhetoric of human rights, in practice human rights plays a pretty marginal role in global policy solutions being crafted among states to manage terrorism. And this gap between using the words but the implementation of policy exists while states are still abusing, engaged in all kinds of abuses. They include ongoing disappearances, systematic torture, extrajudicial execution, including the use of drones, and notwithstanding the global outrage around rendition, still uses, we now call it transfer. We've got a different word. And when we want to be nice about it, we will call it lawful transfer, because there's a legal document between two states. All to say, basic, sustained human rights violations by states in the name of countering terrorism create a real challenge globally. They're particularly problematic in the context where that's done in the name of an all-of-UN approach, or it's done in the context of the perceived imperateur of global institutions in the context of countering terrorism. And so as that gap between theory and practice awns, it doesn't go unnoticed by those whose grievances and the context they live in, which are giving rise to politically motivated violence in the first place. So if states profess their commitments to human rights, but then they engage in profoundly violative behavior with relative impunity, people notice. And that gap between what you say and what you do really matters, and is profoundly linked to this question of the relationship between the conditions conducive to terrorism and the violence we see every day. So I start where I began, which is underscoring the indisputable and essential link between human rights and security. As I said at the beginning, they're not two practices or concepts at odds with each other. They are fundamentally intertwined and codependent. Human rights without security is an illusion, it's impoverished. But the absence of human rights not only speaks to the sort of ethical and moral challenges of policy, but also speaks to ineffective and inefficient counterterrorism practice and policy. So let me stop there, and we have about 20 minutes, I think, for questions.
Field your own questions.
Okay.
defense establishment, both in government and in business, that profits immensely from keeping some horrible threat hovering over us, like terrorism and also Russia lately. And I'm sure you're aware of this possibility. Do you think, it seems like there's so much self-interest involved in perpetuating some of these things and magnifying them. Is there something that can be done about that? These people have been fighting for decades, one way or another, and they're very good.
Well, I would just say, I mean, I think it's really clear that, so one of the pieces of the discussion we don't have is the arms piece, who's arming who. That's not just the kind of, so if you think about a country like Sweden, which is claiming, and does, I think, in many ways seek to walk the walk and talk the talk of an ethical foreign policy and a feminist foreign policy, but is also a major arms exporter. Those two things don't sit very neatly with one another, either intellectually or morally. And it's also clear that the transfer of weapons is a huge global because as we found out with the Free Syrian Army, they don't always stay where you want them to stay.
Yes.
And the cheapest thing to buy in most conflict zones is a weapon.
It's actually,
Cheapest food.
it's one of the few things where our country has a favorable export balance, I believe. is,
Indeed.
Weapons.
But there's no third, I mean, I think sometimes there's a view that the UN is like this third kind of arm out there capable of exercising power separate from states. Just bear in mind, this is an intergovernmental organization, not a supranational organization. Its power exists only insofar as it is contracted, subcontracted by states to do so. And its enforcement capacity is entirely dependent on the will of states to enforce. There isn't an independent enforcement capacity. So ultimately, when you ask the rhetorical, not incorrectly, the rhetorical question, how do we move this? It requires states to move. And within those states, it requires body politics. But if you read, I live between Belfast and Minnesota, but let me tell you, there's often more on the local news here about terrorism than there is in Belfast. And let me tell you, there's lots more terrorism going on in Belfast historically in terms of threat than there is here. So part of it, of course, is this challenge of people's fears being the easy way in which we prey upon people's fears, and the actual risks that one is. Ulrich Beck's book on the Risk Society is a really great read because it tells us really how we've been massaged to be risk averse. So happy to take other questions. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned the rise of white nationalist violence, and I wonder, does that provide global governance structures with a new opportunity to maybe shift this conversation about counterterrorism, or is it just falling into the same pattern?
So I think we're really on the cusp of having that conversation globally. I think historically, both, again, for reasons that are complex at the national level, so for example in the US, crimes that might otherwise be committed, the crimes that might otherwise fall under the umbrella of terrorism have, for historic reasons, including issues related to the First Amendment and free speech issues, have fallen into the category of hate groups, not terrorist groups, and hate speech, not terrorism, and also, one would say perhaps some institutional unwillingness or inability to view certain actors as engaged in acts of terrorism, notwithstanding if they formally meet that criteria. So I think some things are shifting. One is, I will say, there are multiple forms of global threat. Threats from Daesh, Al-Qaeda, these groups, Al-Nusra Front, these are meaningful, significant threats, and they've diminished with the fall of the caliphate, they're not going away. But it is clear that as we look at the last 3 years, at least in these globally recorded statistics, that the category of extreme right terrorism is increasing. And bearing in mind that that's often related to what's defined in that box, so that box might actually be higher than we see it. So I think there is a national conversation happening, triggered by events, obviously like the tragic events in New Zealand. There is also, I think, a willingness the Security Council has placed, they don't use the word right-wing terrorism, and they have used the phrase other threats. So that's an interesting, we have little hesitation using other global terms to describe certain other threats. So it is on the agenda, and my mandate this is an issue that I am looking at very closely and probably will report on to either the Security Council or the General Assembly in the next year or so. But bearing in mind, it requires thinking about the international standards that we have and seeing how the patterns and trends of these groups fit into the global legal structure that we have. So that includes things like looking at their financing, looking at their cross-border functioning, so there are certain pieces that, as a lawyer, as a pedantic doctrinal matter, you have to see if they really fit all the boxes. I'm not sure that they do fit all of them, but I envisage that they will certainly fit some.
So I had a question that goes back to your three powers. So you can be invited by states to investigate or inspect.
Yeah.
And then you get all of these individual complaints or requests.
Right.
How do you is there any ability to reconcile the two and investigate the individual ones
Right.
if you're not invited by
Right.
the offending state?
Yeah. So the process of getting a state to invite you is like running for election. You kiss babies, but the relevant equivalent is diplomats. You're nice to diplomats and governments. So there's a process in a positive way of engaging a government. My view as special rapporteur is if I show up and just criticize a government, like just find the 10 things they're doing wrong, that's not helpful. None of us do well being told what we're doing badly all the time. And I recognize, and I've lived in a society that has been deeply violent, that states face often impossible choices between security and there are enormous pressures on governments. And that's one of the challenges we're facing right now, is governments being constantly to legislate, to look like they're responsive just by virtue of the pressure being placed on them. So part of my role in trying to line up those visits is to really engage, spend a lot of time with governments, really talking about the kind of dialogue I want to have with them. I offer technical assistance, so that means that it's not just a case of saying, here are the things you're doing wrong. It's also about saying, here are the things that you might do differently, or here's a way to do this that's not what you're doing right now, or here's some resources or capacities that you might draw upon to do this better. So that's part of getting the governments to take you. Some governments don't take visits, and that's a challenge. Some of them are the mandate. Well, there's a list on my website, so you can tell who said yes and who said no. And that's a challenge, because those are states where actually it's not just the special rapporteur goes in, but I do follow up, and so the idea is that you build a set of relationships either with the security sector or with the intelligence services or different groups, and in that way you can help get, over the longer term, some positive change, and hopefully you empower and enable civil society, right? Because you come and go, you do a short visit to a country, you're trying to actually help create and support the local voices who are actually the best place to take that dialogue forward in the long term. When you visit and you have particular communications, so yes, that often, so on prisoners, that will often help me figure out who I want to see, who I will ask to see. So if I visit, I can visit any place of detention and any named prisoner. So sometimes that helps. Sometimes it allows me to raise individual cases that I've seen in communications and bring a heightened level of scrutiny. I don't have it, my office is not a judicial office, so it's really partly mobilizing the shame and concern of a government that it's being scrutinized very closely on a particular case, and a visit can help that. So sometimes, a practical example of that, I visited France and Belgium last year, and during the course of that visit, I met with a large number of families whose children had become jihadists. So some of these are families who they're religiously observant Muslim families, some are not religiously observant Muslim families, some are Christian families whose children converted and went to join jihad, some are children whose children were kind of adventurers. They thought this was the equivalent of the Spanish Civil War. They thought they were going to fight the good fight in Syria. So, but these families have been extraordinarily marginalized. They are seen as security threats because they are connected to people who are seen as security threats. And much of our intelligence gathering in the counterterrorism space is around association. So meeting with those families, hearing them, but also because a special rapporteur saw them as a group and was able to articulate that to government, puts both of those governments on notice that these families are also victims. Many of them have experienced extreme harm, sometimes loss of earnings, sometimes they've been the subject of highly intrusive security engagements because they're children or family members. So that's a way in which, by meeting a group that I had identified through communications as feeling the harsh edge of counter-terrorism measures, that meeting or working with them was positive. And there was a question here, yes?
I was thinking about, comparing Kashmir versus Syria,
Right.
because Kashmir seems so clear, that there is violation and there is a state. But I think I saw some interviews with those early protesters who were picked up in Syria. Names,
Yes.
it was just so, and who's going to speak for them? Because in some ways, both sides wanted this solution to the war, and yet now we can't go to the Syrian government.
Oh, we are. We're about to start rebuilding them.
Oh, okay.
That's not good news. No,
I
well,
was gonna say, who is we here?
the we is,
The
Yeah.
international community, in a
Right.
sense, let this outcome come about.
right.
So I was thinking about that. And just a second point about, you talked about terrorists as can be very difficult term, and that has come really true in the Afghan negotiations,
Right.
because the three of the members who are
Guantanamo
representing the
detainees.
Taliban government were in Guantanamo Bay.
Yes.
So, who are the terrorists in,
Right.
in that sense?
Yeah, let me just say, Syria is an extraordinarily complex conflict. The recognition of the status of that conflict remains highly contested. So Syria views it as not a conflict, but in a series of engagements with a group of terrorists. You have other states who, bear in mind, recognize the Syrian Democratic Forces as the legitimate government. I'm sort of hearing echoes of Mr. Maduro in Venezuela. So at one point, and bear in mind that when many of these young jihadists traveled to Syria, you had European governments flirting and actually recognizing these entities as being the legitimate governments. So that raises a whole set of issues around, the understanding of whether it was criminal to travel to do what they did at the point where they did it. So we have a problem that's, in one government's view, a terrorism problem. We have other governments that describe this as a civil war, evacuating the fact that there are multiple states engaged on various sides, arming and enabling, and sometimes providing direct military assistance and direction to the forces. So, from an IHL laws of war perspective, we would say this is an internationalized internal armed conflict. But the question of accountability is enormous and will not be easily met. One is, we have violations by state forces, by the Syrian government. But we are now in a process where we have a winner. He won. So the chances in which we will see systematic accountability for state violations, it appears to me to be limited. If I were Mr. al-Bashir, President al-Bashir, I wouldn't be traveling to a state with universal jurisdiction soon, but there are lots of other places that don't. So I would suspect we're not going to see mass accountability. And there's a massive rush, and when I say we are rebuilding, there's a commercial opportunity, let's just call it that, to rebuild. And so one of the things that's complicated here is both the humanitarian need to do rebuilding and to rebuild Syria, but also recognizing that this is a self-interested economic opportunity, which is driving the way in which we then engage with the Syrian government. On the other hand, I also want to say we have massive and systematic violations by non-state actors, ISIL, Al-Nusra Front, and others. Right now, we are mostly only, I say we, some Western states are charging them primarily with crimes of, the travelling is now a criminal offence. It's mandated by the Security Council is now in the business of regulating criminal law, which includes requiring states to criminalise certain acts. So they required in 2014 that there be regulation of travel with the intent to join this kind of organisation. That's now pretty much globally enforced, actually. We have pretty much, you can say 100% pickup, but really high pickup. So we're charging and convicting them of travel and of membership of these organisations. But we're generally not charging them with the substantive offences, partly because we don't have evidence. A lot of this evidence remains on the battlefield, so there's a huge problem of translating that into a legal process. And capacity. Who's going to prosecute them? Syria is not. It would rather have other solutions, I believe, to that problem. And then we have countries like Iraq prosecuting, but we have serious fair trial concerns about Iraqi courts. So we have large numbers of jihadis, their wives or partners, or coerced women who went to them, being held in detention camps, being charged. And we're having trials, but people, the Special Rapporteur's Office and many other entities have deep and grave concerns about the fairness of those trials. Yeah.
Given your access to greater information in this new UN job that you're taking on, is there anything you learned that has surprised you? And are you more optimistic or less optimistic about human rights in an age of counterterrorism?
So I think what has surprised me is that your allies are not always, the states that one would conceive of as being historically on the side of human rights, rule of law, good governance. We're in a very, very difficult moment. The United States is one country where the backsliding on kind of is obvious, but we have other countries, Viktor Orban's Hungary, Poland, Brazil, the Philippines. We have government leaders who advocate breaking the law, including their treaty obligations, engaging in extrajudicial executions, advocating for torture. So this is, by that, and then we have states that you don't expect to be helpful, but that are either, again, I would say they're self-interested, they want legitimacy, they're seeking to have greater influence in their own ways, they're speaking to certain constituencies in their home country, but so that surprised me, that you can have allies, unexpected allies, in a positive way. Has surprised me. What has also surprised me, and what I think most people are not aware of, is the extent and degree to which the Security Council is acting as a global legislator in the space of counterterrorism. It is regulating criminal law. It is requiring there was a Security Council resolution in 2017 that requires every state in the world to develop biometric data. You would not get that through half the parliaments of any, Ireland, you would have grave difficulty. But bear in mind that a Security Council resolution enacted under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter is a mandate of compliance to states, and it's highly convenient for states. Because if you don't think you can get biometric data collection through your national parliament, you can say, but we have a Security Council resolution that requires us to legislate, or we will be in breach of our Security Council obligations. So the scale of regulation by the Security Council and the intrusiveness of that regulation on national sovereignty has been enormously surprising to me. And I am, not from a human rights perspective, from states' own sovereignty interests, the lack of a coherent defense to the right of states to limit the role of the Security Council has been surprising. Am I optimistic? I don't know. I'm like halfway up. It's like Sisyphus. I'm driving a rock up the mountain, so it's really hard for me to tell. I'm like, is it going to roll down again? Probably going to roll down again. So it's hard. I feel we're in a very, very difficult moment. But here's the thing. Human rights is the long fight. Anybody who's in this business for a short run should go home. So it will be my lifetime and my choice. So these fights are not fought in a day. So if you're in it for the really long haul. Do you have a question or the back? Yes.
mentioned how we haven't reached a global definition, right, of terrorism, and even if we did, right, there would possibly be so many different interpretations of that definition.
I have a definition. I recommend mine.
Okay. So what I was going to ask, what are you working with? And then second, if in some ways, and you recognize this, right, that certain peoples get labeled as terrorists, right, others don't, and that also has to do, with maybe certain historical representations of certain people being either more violent, or certain spaces in the world actually being spaces of violence.
Yeah.
And so, how desirable is it? And maybe this is not asking, the UN rapporteur, but maybe the academic, and not that they don't work with each other, but what would the academic say in terms of so definitions of terrorism, or the labeling, right, of certain groups as primarily terrorists? Is that, would it be better to think, of some as distinct organizations that does require different measures and approaches? And if, even though there might not be some global definition, it travels, or it is a category that travels in labeling certain peoples. But is it what I hear you saying, and maybe I should read the report, right? But I can see it, at least in the context of Central America, where counterterrorism measures are being used to criminalize civil society actors, right? And so I suppose is actually the category more pernicious in terms of its effects than actually useful in terms of generating, some kind of global agenda to.
So there's 10 questions in there.
There's a lot.
But they're all good. So let me start with saying the mandate. My predecessor, Martin Scheinen, who was the first special rapporteur appointed in 2005, he developed a model definition of terrorism, and that definition really draws on existing consensus among states. The core of that definition, of course, involves the use of violence, right? So one of the things, for example, we're seeing is, that term violent extremism, but now then there's a slippage to extremism so we're seeing different words, different categories, but the core piece of the definition of terrorism includes the use of violence. And it also includes the targeting of civilians, right? And it also includes acts, not thought, not things you think. You may think all kinds of things. And that's where the language of radicalization, I think, is extremely pernicious and quite challenging right now. We're talking about radical extremism. Marx? Who are we talking about exactly? Who would be the radical extremist, right? And so that core definition was built by the mandate, drawing on the work that's been done, and there's been a 30-year, well, it's like more than 30-year process in the United Nations 6th Committee to try and agree a comprehensive treaty on terrorism. And the mandate drew on where the consensus lay among states to put forward this definition, which when I engage with states on their national definitions of terrorism, that's the definition I use. And the second thing I would say around, I think this goes to your second comment that I didn't answer, was the discussion around, who's in whose eyes, right? So one of the most, I'm talking about human rights today, but I often say that the most endangered species of law in this area is not human rights law, but actually the law of armed conflict and the laws of war. Because the states would like to put all of these actors into the terrorism box and take them out of the war box, because that gets us out of discussions, for example, on self-determination. If we talk about terrorists, we don't talk about, but if we talk about armed groups who meet the criteria that under the law of armed conflict, then we're talking about groups that actually do have status in international law. So one of the things we're seeing is that states are using the terrorism box to move conflicts and challengers who actually may have claims. I'm not going to pronounce on the validity of X groups or Y groups' claims, but who have legitimate claims that might be recognized under international law and would be protected by the laws of war. They obviously then are targetable, but they're also potentially can be POWs, and they have to adhere to those norms. So the space here that you're describing, the sort of space between the terrorist and the freedom fighter is often the kind of word that's used, but it's really between persons who would be reasonably protected by the law of war, who are armed groups that satisfy the criteria for combatancy, and groups, and most governments' attempts to shift all that into terrorism. Now, one of the reasons why I think that's maybe a mistake by governments, as we've seen, is that limits your space for negotiation. I mean, at the end of the day, many of these, in places where and that, don't get me wrong, doesn't mean that these groups aren't using terrorist methods that are war crimes under the law of war and can be penalized in that way. But it does mean that you limit your capacity to engage with these groups and to address the underlying issues of self-determination or grievance or land claim or political representation or minority rights. You lose all of that discussion the minute you use the word terrorist. And I mean, terrorism is like a Voldemort word. It evacuates the room, right? You can't, and if you even, as both in my policy work but as a scholar, when you appear to be using that word, you, as John Ashcroft infamously said after 9, you're either with us or against us. So we create these places where you actually can't even engage in an intellectual discussion as to who reasonably ought to be in what box and why. So that's governments. There's a huge challenge. And you know, the Taliban is a really interesting example right now. We wouldn't recognize them. I mean, as an international lawyer, I would say the US was simply wrong on the law by failing to recognize them. We may not like the Taliban. We may not have recognized them as a government. But they were effectively the lawful government of Afghanistan. They had effective control over their territory the day 9/11 happened. And our lumping them into a box with Al-Qaeda was neither legally sophisticated nor tactically very helpful in the long run, as we're now finding out when we're negotiating with them again, right? So that's an interesting one. The other thing I just want to say about definitions is that states are not the only entities doing definitions of terrorism these days. And one of the most pernicious spaces is the use of the definitions that are being used by media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and others. So as Special Rapporteur, I have had a year-long engagement with Facebook, and some of this is public. So I can say what so Facebook has its own definition of terrorism. Created by its community standards. Here's an interesting thing. So again, what is that process? It's not like, okay, so we know that states are struggling to get a definition of terrorism. But if you want to find out what that debate is, you go to the records of the 6th Committee, you go to the Security Council debates, they're public, you can watch them on C-SPAN. You can find out what states are saying about, it's a transparent, open process. You don't like the way your government is doing that definition, you theoretically, and in many places, look at what happened in Algeria today and other days, there are democratic processes where citizens, civil society, and others can engage on that definition. Here we have these unaccountable media platforms defining their own definitions of terrorism with greater regulatory capacity than most states, right? And more money. Absolutely. So, I mean, my mandate has had a public discussion with Facebook on the lack of any connection between their definition of terrorism and the consensus definition of terrorism, such as it exists by states. Because we have lots of agreement on acts of terrorism. We have like lots of treaties on things that are terrorist, like hijacking an aircraft, terrorist, right? It's not that we don't have agreement. There are some things we don't have agreement on. There's actually quite a lot that we do agree on. Who you can target, what you can do, that kind of thing. So I think it's deeply concerning that these entities are self-defining the universe, and they also have lists of groups, not public, of who they define as terrorists. Now again, in the UN system, not perfect, or the European Union, if there's an action to be taken against you as a group, we have something called a sanctions list. We have an Al-Qaeda sanctions list, a 1267 list. There's a process, not perfect, but nonetheless, at least there's a process, and if you end up on that list as an individual, you have a right to appeal. We have an ombudsperson in the UN system. Not perfect, but nonetheless, at least a process where a due process model can be applied. None of that applies to these platforms who are regulating as quasi-states. And I think that is as much of a threat as the threat of state kind of overreach or underreach in these areas. Yes, hiya, how are you?
Thank you for this amazing talk. Today I was just reading actually Jason Lamchek's book, Human Rights Compliant Counterterrorism, and he was calling that term, human rights compliant counterterrorism, a myth.
Right.
And for him it was a myth. For him it was a myth because, and it has something to do with the definition of terrorism, but he's not saying that, okay, this definition is too ambiguous and therefore we end up with tons of problems, but he's saying that, and I think he's kind of right on that, he's saying that it only focuses on non-state actors.
Right.
And state violence does not count as terrorism. And when I go back to your definition,
Right.
use of violence, targeting of civilians, and it is not taught violence.
Right.
All these items can be used to call certain states terrorist states.
Yes.
But because the focus is on non-state actors,
Right.
terrorism itself.
I mean, this is why the Sixth Committee doesn't have an agreed definition of terrorism, because there is a view by some states that you can have state terrorism. Interestingly, we do use, I mean, the United States does use that term, state-sponsored terrorism. We talk about it in relation to certain states in relation to their support for non-state actor groups, but not the state itself. So I don't think we've solved that question in the sense, I actually think that's still a live debate among states. Some states genuinely feel that that ought to be included in any definition. And I don't think we'll get agreement on it, because I think there's a reason why the permanent 5 members of the Security Council in particular are opposed to that definition, to including that in. On the broader kind of conceptual question, do I think there can be, I have to kind of do a split personality thing as special rapporteur, where I have to work with states every day and international institutions and encourage the best possible behavior. And, the broader question of politically motivated, but if we took out the word terrorism and we started talking about politically motivated violence and looked at the causes, because terrorism that word stops conversation. It stops the intellectual and practical engagement with causality. It inherently engages in blame, shame, processes of othering, and it puts the terrorist, just like the pirate of the 16th century, as the kind of enemy of mankind. And don't get me wrong, I've lived in a society where people called terrorists have done extraordinary harm. But I'm not sure that that language helps us either get past or get out of the cyclical violence that we appear to be in multiple states and globally. So I'm not, with you. I think I have an intellectual sympathy for the notion that idea of doing human rights compliant counterterrorism has certain inherent problems. As a practical matter, this language of terrorism and counterterrorism is so embedded in the global system. It is such an enabler for states. Right now, every state, after 9/11, the Security Council passed a resolution called UN Security Council Resolution 1373. It requires every state to have counter-terrorism legislation. And I was recently in Geneva, and Sri Lanka, as many of you will know, has gone through an incredibly challenging process of a war, reconstruction, a new government, and the Sri Lankan government are rewriting their counterterrorism legislation. And I met with a number of groups, and I was told that Sri Lankan civil society was in a deep splits, because there were particularly Tamil groups who felt strongly that they should argue for no counterterrorism legislation. The position should be nothing, because there's been such abuse. And then other parts of civil society who were arguing that there ought to be just human rights compliant counterterrorism law in Sri Lanka. And I was asked as special rapporteur you know, what did I think? And I said, Sri Lanka, whether I like it or not, Sri Lanka does not have a choice. Every state is required under Chapter 7 resolution of the Security Council to have counterterrorism law. And states who showed up to the Counterterrorism Committee in the aftermath of 9/11 and said, we don't need counterterrorism law, we don't have a terrorism problem, they were told, go back and write counterterrorism law. So that position of zero law is untenable, which tells us how embedded it is both nationally and internationally. So I think we're a long way away from deconstructing those apparatuses. Yes, and then
I'm from another deeply violent society, which is Israel. I'm guessing they're on that list of countries that don't invite you to visit them.
I
I
haven't
wonder if
asked.
you have anything in your toolbox against countries that don't want you there.
So I visit Israel pretty regularly, actually.
Oh, you do?
I do. I have family there. So, so what would I say? The law of occupation is one of my subfields. So I write a lot about the law of occupation. So here's a really interesting, let's just start with that. A legal interface between the law of occupation is covered by the 4th Geneva Convention and the additional protocols to the Geneva Convention. That body of law is clearly applicable to the occupied Palestinian territories, and there's a big argument amongst mostly the Israeli government and others as to whether it applies to Gaza, whether Gaza remains de facto occupied, notwithstanding that Israel has withdrawn to the periphery, which it continues to go in, because it in part continues to go in and out with impunity. Here we have another example where actually the language of terrorism has overtaken any discussion of occupation and the obligations and rights. So what are the rights, including, and it's challenging to say this without again going into the Ashcroft box, what are the legitimate rights of persons who are occupied to resist occupation? Where does that slip over into acts that are unacceptable under international law? Israel remains deeply challenging. My mandate has issued a number of communications concerning issues related to detention, including the detention of children, widespread detention of children from the occupied territories, ill treatment of those children, lack of access to lawyers, military detention, extended military detention, the use of force, including against civilians, civil society activists. So yes, and one of the reasons that there's a special rapporteur on the occupied territories who has not been admitted to those territories. And therefore the position of other special rapporteurs like myself is that that is the rapporteur who should have primary access before any others, and it's unlikely they will get. They have a consistent request to visit that has not been accepted. The back, yeah?
You mentioned towards the end of your speech that terrorism does not arise in a vacuum. Can you expand upon that, or like what you mean by that? Yeah,
I mean, so there will be violent, self-motivated individuals who will engage in acts of violence sort of off their own volition. And some of those acts will be viewed as terrorism, but in reality, most of those individuals are in some way connected, right? So we think about, for example, and here there's a challenge, the radicalization we're seeing through access to internet content or through online sources or through old-fashioned recruitment, you know, so the individual act has all of these other prompts, right? That's one set of prompts. The challenge right now is that that set of prompts is being really, governments are focusing on massive content stripping that may in many ways go beyond what is either lawful or proportionate to respond to that. And human rights, so there's a number of studies. This UNDP study, The Vacuum, has looked at the way in which different factors affect radicalization. The most significant factor amongst all of the studies that we've seen, that we consistently see, are human rights violations. When the government engages in a cycle of rights denying or rights grievance creation, that has an enormous radicalizing or motivating effect. Poor governance appears to be another factor that has a high correlation. So again, the acts of an individual are their own acts, but they're connected to these others, what in UN parlance we call conditions conducive, the things that create the soup in which these actions are molded and grow. Socioeconomic opportunity is clearly and lack of opportunity, particularly for young men. And this is a primary driver that we're seeing, particularly on the African continent right now. Because joining a terrorist, I want to say this again, and it's not, just to note the obvious, it's not an apology for terrorism, but just to say, if you live in a society where you can't get a job, where you have no route to status as a young man, where your access to land is limited, where all of the social and economic bolsters are inaccessible or unavailable to you. It is, using a sort of an economic choice model, it is not an irrational choice to join an organization that pays you a wage, that gives you status, and that will compensate your family if anything happens to you. So again, it's like understanding, we don't think of that as a rational choice in this society, but by and large, people have other choices. So that's what I mean by that kind of, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because, and just final caveat I want to say about that is, of course, we have lots of individuals who join non-state organizations who are not poor, who are not disenfranchised. Al-Qaeda, some of the leadership of Al-Qaeda is a really interesting study in that, in radicalization processes that don't appear to drive from economic disenfranchisement. So I want to be really careful about saying that's always the issue, and that there aren't other factors, including, so for young Muslim men in Europe, the outsider status of that community, the feeling of non-integration, the outsider status in that may be its own thing, even if your day-to-day life is moderately comfortable or well or capable. So that's the kind of context I think about, or some of it. Yes, right here.
Thank you. This has been an amazing discussion. I'm curious about, in your role as a special rapporteur, there are the sort of existing power dynamics between NGOs, say, from the global north that are international, and the more, and say NGOs from the global south, or people's movements, and so on and so forth, that are all concerned about human rights. But obviously, coming from a position of power leads to biases in what is, A, the